Hi, everyone. My name is Rafa Shams. I'm the Director of Communications and Programming at the Academic Engagement Network, and I am pleased to welcome you to AEN's first webinar of the 2023-24 academic year, the U.S. National Strategy to Counter Antisemitism, Assessing its Impact on Campus and in the Academy. At this time, I'd like to thank our members, colleagues from partner organizations who are invited to attend, and several of our supporters for joining us today. This webinar topic generated considerable interest, and we had a large number of registrations. Like most of our programming, the webinar isn't open to the general public, but we do want to record it, as many faculty members wanted to attend, but due to teaching and other obligations couldn't make it. We'll share the video recording at a later time. So in May of this year, the Biden-Harris administration released the U.S. National Strategy to Counter Antisemitism. This is an ambitious and comprehensive effort to engage many stakeholders throughout U.S. society, from government agencies to civil society organizations to community leaders, to address the unsettling rise of anti-Semitism in this country. The strategy is of particular interest to AEN, as an organization which works with faculty and administrators to counter campus anti-Semitism. We're keenly aware of the scope of the problem. In a recent survey we conducted of our membership, 84% of respondents reported personally experiencing or witnessing anti-Semitism on their campus in the past 5 years, with 75% saying the situation has worsened or stayed the same. That is why we have organized this panel of 5 distinguished faculty members and organizational leaders who will share their diverse perspectives on the national strategy and discuss the ways in which it intersects with and may impact the work they do on campus and within the academy. Miriam Elman, Executive Director of AEN, will start us off by sharing AEN's perspective on the strategy and the ways in which we feel it presents opportunities and challenges for our work. Then we will hear from our other panelists, who are Sara Coodin, Director of Academic Affairs at the American Jewish Committee, Richard Herman, Senior Counselor for the Jewish United Fund, Federation of Metropolitan Chicago, and formerly the Chancellor of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Casey Johnson, Professor of History at Brooklyn College, and Alyza Lewin, President of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. A Q&A will follow the presentations. You can type in your questions using the chat function or the raised hand function, but we ask that you please refrain from doing so until all the presentations are over. So without any further ado, Miriam, it's over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Rafa, and thanks to our panelists and to all of you for joining AEN's first webinar of the academic year. And as Rafa mentioned, we thought today's topic would be useful to start off the fall semester. It's been a few months since the national strategy was released, and we've all had some time to wade through it and to consider what its impact may be. So Rafa, you can start sharing the slides. And, you know, AEN was engaged for some time with the national strategy before it was released. Some of our faculty provided their input in the months, and you have to go to the first one, in the months before, joining over 1,000 Jewish stakeholders to provide their perspectives during listening sessions. And our members were able to share some best practices for combating campus anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish inclusion, like establishing task forces or Jewish advisory councils charged with developing campus action plans with measurable benchmarks and milestones. And in the weeks before the national strategy was unveiled, AEN also joined many partner organizations to share our concerns about efforts to discredit the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and to urge the administration to recognize it as a valuable educational tool. So up on the slide are some excerpts of a statement that was written by our faculty members in the section for law faculty. And once the national strategy was released, you know, we were really pleased that the IHRA definition was embraced. I'll leave it to others on the panel to maybe deal with the issue of whether the nexus definition should have also been in there. But I'll take, quote, embrace as the way that the IHRA definition is viewed in this major US policy document. The document also reaffirms the United States' unshakable commitment to the State of Israel's right to exist, to its legitimacy, to its security, makes clear that when Israel is singled out because of anti-Jewish hatred, that is anti-Semitism. And later, the strategy devotes a section to anti-Semitism on campus, right, and states explicitly, quote, everyone has a right to learn in an environment free from anti-Semitic harassment. So you can go to the next slide, Rafa. When we saw the strategy, and particularly the short fact sheet that was released along with it, we were really pleased to see that AN was positively mentioned in the national strategy. So it wasn't explicitly that we were mentioned, but this project on the slide that we are funding that educates administrators in schools of education across the country, that was referenced on page 8 of the White House fact sheet. So go AEN. And then since its release, the national strategy has really helped us to recruit administrators into our signature seminar series. And you can go to the next slide, Rafa. A year-long professional program that starts in just a couple weeks. We had 25 spaces for this year's program, and we received 47 applications. Certainly word of mouth helps. We have a number of alums who have said good things about our program and encouraged their colleagues to apply. But it certainly didn't hurt to have the White House release the first ever US national strategy to counter anti-Semitism at exactly the same time we were recruiting for this program, and to have the Biden administration push for anti-Semitic bias and discrimination programming to be included in the work that's done on campus diversity and inclusion. So, as you all know, we are a pretty diverse lot in AEN. We're united and aligned on our vision and on our mission, but we often differ with regard to strategy and approach. And in this case, once the strategy was released in late May, my email inbox, Rafa's inbox, and others in the AEN staff began to fill up. And some faculty members wrote us urging us to release a statement. We collected those responses. There were those very much in favor of the national strategy and wanted us to write a statement in support. And there were those who shared their concerns and wanted us to write a statement in opposition. So in the end, we didn't write anything. We didn't release our own AN statement. And instead, we're inviting our 14 sections and interest groups in AN to discuss and debate the issues together this fall as a follow-up to this webinar that we're holding. Next slide. So here's some of the positive responses we heard from members, and I think these are similar to those that were raised by many organizations in the Jewish and pro-Israel space. Many of our members were really taken with the whole of society comprehensive approach that the strategy adopts, along with the call for allyship, collective action, and intercommunal solidarity. The national strategy's overarching message that everyone has a stake in this fight did resonate with a number of our members, and many voiced support for that. And they also liked that the strategy doesn't just focus on the oi of being Jewish, but also on the joy of being Jewish, with an emphasis on celebrating and broadening awareness and understanding of Jewish American heritage. And next slide, Rafa. As for the criticisms, this is the one that really kept coming up in our email inbox from members. And, it was also something that other organizations in our space shared, and that is, why the heck is CARE in there, right? So the Council on American Islamic Relations announced a commitment to counter anti-Semitism. It is included in the White House fact sheet as a partner in this work. This is an organization that, as many of you know, denounces white supremacy while promoting virulently anti-Semitic hoaxes and conspiracy theories like the Deadly Exchange campaign. and often insist that Jews are acting in bad faith to shut down Palestinian voices when they raise the charge of anti-Semitism. CARE's leadership spends an inordinate amount of its time defending anti-Semites as not being anti-Semitic. In my view, its leadership is actually in desperate need of an anti-Semitism awareness training. And I would agree with the critics who say it's absurd to have this group included as a partner in the work. I want to close with just two observations, and you can go to the next slide, Rafa. The first, in terms of our work at AAN, I think one of the most exciting elements of this national strategy for campus and the academy is that there will be new funding opportunities for research on anti-Semitism. Having dedicated federal funds for scholarship on contemporary anti-Semitism is going to be a game changer. And I know that a number of our faculty members are eagerly awaiting the call for proposals, the RFPs, to come out this fall from the NEH and from the National Science Foundation. They'll be applying for funding. Some of our members in AAN will certainly be tapped to serve on review committees at the NEH and NSF for this work. It's going to be a shot in the arm for all the work that we and many of our partner organizations are trying to support on anti-Semitism research, but we do it on a shoestring. And now we're going to have the federal government putting in money, serious money for that. And it's not something I really expected. I did not expect this national strategy to have an entire page emphasizing research and how the federal government will support that. So I think that's really terrific. And second, I think we need to be mindful that this national strategy isn't a magic bullet. It's not a panacea. It doesn't mean we can stop doing the hard work that we do on campus, in the trenches of the campus, in the trenches of the professional associations and scholarly journals and academic presses. You know, since the national strategy was released, we've seen so many incidents and developments on campus, and I just share a few of them on the slide from this summer and recent weeks, whether it's at Princeton or at CUNY, or an awful speaker like Roger Waters coming to UPenn in a few weeks, or this disturbing new institute that has just been launched. And in my view, I just don't think the national strategy is going to help us deal or address these issues, not when it comes to poor pedagogical choices, poor judgments that faculty members make, the way it lands on Jewish students, not when it comes to courses, curriculum, hires, conferences that will bring what AAN calls, quote, merchants of hatred to campus, because I just don't think the strategy can be used in that specific way. I do think where it's helpful is in those instances where Jewish students are harassed, are discriminated against, are excluded from campus spaces on account of their connection to Israel or their Zionist identities. And we can see that in the emphasis in the new guidance that was just released last week by the Department of Education. This guidance flows very naturally from the national strategy. I think it'll be a big help to us. And we've seen plenty of cases like that of Jewish students being unable to express their Zionist identities or to participate equally in campus life because of their attachments to Israel. So at the end of the day, though, we're still going to have to keep on doing what we do, fighting the good fight, being our own change agents on the campus and in the larger academy. I don't think we can rely on this national strategy to do the work for us. I am curious to see what my fellow panelists have to say about that and whether they agree. And I'll close there and turn it over to the next panelist. Thank you.
So I think the next panelist is me, right?
It is, yes. Go ahead, Sara.
Great. I'll let you know when I want you to screen share. It's just a little late then. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and to Rafa and Miriam for convening this panel. I think it's a really important topic. And I'd like to start by pointing out that really, despite how significant this national strategy felt to me and to AJC, our campus partners, our administrative campus partners, have by and large still not heard about this strategy at all. This July, I took a group of university presidents to Israel, and none of them had heard about this plan. So first and foremost, we have an enormous amount of work to do communicating the national strategy's key features and its action steps to university administrators and to faculty and students. Now, AJC has really not kept quiet about our incredibly positive response to this strategy, and we've designated it as really the core of our organization's advocacy work in the coming year. We've developed a task force to implement its action steps, which you can see on our website. And AJC was also one of the key interlocutors for the White House as they devised this strategy. And we can see a lot of our key positions reflected in it, including a nonpartisan political approach that enjoins a host of societal sectors in the fight against anti-Semitism, an insistence on the importance of intergroup cooperation, and a focus on the well-being of the Jewish people and upholding democracy. Today, I really want to bring one particular feature of this 60+ page document into focus for discussion. It's an element of anti-Semitism that I return to often because it represents one puzzle piece in the work that I do with administrators, advocating for the place of Jews and anti-Semitism awareness particularly within DEI spaces. And that feature is conspiracism. It's the aspect of anti-Semitic discourse that's enjoined to theories about Jewish power, domination, control of key sectors, global finance, politics, and the media. Examples of these appear on both the extreme left and the extreme right of the political spectrum, and both use Jews as token figures for the imagined corruption of our social institutions. Rafa, you can actually put up the slide now so we can have a look at one excerpt from pretty early on. It's on page 6. If you're able to share your screen, great.
Oh, thank you. Is Peter here?
To come up, there we go.
Oh, yum. Oh, yum.
So let's see if we've got the right section here. Yeah, so it's the bottom paragraph on our current screen here. While anti-Semitism most directly and intensely affects the American Jewish community, anti-Semitism also threatens the democracy, values, safety, and rights of Americans. The hatred of Jews shares much in common with other forms of hate, such as racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny. It also has unique characteristics that require tailored responses and can manifest distinctively. While many American Jews identify as a vulnerable minority group, especially as anti-Semitism surges, Jews tend to be assailed for having too much privilege and too much power. This is a persistent feature of anti-Semitism. It rests on a conspiracy theory. At its core, anti-Semitism, like numerous forms of hate, divides Americans by scapegoating certain people, erodes our trust in government and social institutions, threatens our democracy, and undermines our core values of freedom, community, and decency. Thus, it is imperative that Americans of all backgrounds and beliefs work together to counter the scourge with urgency. Thanks, Rafa. So anti-Semitism's conspiratorial aspect is named here as a distinctive feature, something that sets it apart from other forms of racism and discrimination. There is no attempt here to align anti-Semitism with structural racism. The national strategy also doesn't lead by attempting to define anti-Semitism or weighing directly in on issues that are top of mind for most of us, the question of overlap between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Instead, the conspiracism associated with anti-Semitism acquires importance in this strategy because of the ways that conspiracism erodes popular trust in the institutions that underwrite democracy. So the argument is one that sidesteps the questions of structural oppression and of definition, and instead charts an incredibly capacious pathway towards assessing and addressing anti-Semitism that includes everyone who is invested in safeguarding American democracy. And the particular Jewish cause is enjoined into the general American cause. These strategic shifts are, I think, worth considering and unpacking more carefully. And there's, again, a lot in this 60-page document, but this particular feature sort of caught my attention early on. If we lean heavily on anti-Semitism's conspiratorial aspect, combating Jew hatred becomes an investment in the democracy that sustains our political order. It suggests a way to enlist broad social support for a problem that affects everyone because of the ways that it undermines faith in our shared financial system, our shared reporting system for news, the shared ecosystem of world politics and diplomacy. The American population really seems primed to side with this idea on the one hand. In our most recent survey, an overwhelming majority of Americans, over 90% of the general population, agreed that anti-Semitism is a problem that affects all of society, not only Jews. And this is an approach that resonates in many ways with AJC's core mission of promoting the well-being of the Jewish people and the advancement of democratic ideals. Both are really central to AJC's global advocacy work. However, an approach that enjoins the particular Jewish cause to the broader and much more general cause of democracy also doesn't lead with the particulars of Jewish identity, with the ways that we're marked as distinct from the general population, or with our historical dispossessions, our traumas, our victimhood, the oi factor. Instead, it enjoins us to the general population through this shared investment in something larger. Within the current cultural zeitgeist, particularly on college campuses, which tend to skew more progressive than the community at large, this can be at odds with the extant rationale that's in place for discussing and addressing difference, especially within DEI programming, where many of these discussions are staged. The defining criteria for having a voice within those spaces is structural, socioeconomic, and racialized dispossession. The imperative towards equity in those spaces doesn't recognize Jews as marginalized minorities. It perceives us as socioeconomically privileged and white passing enough to benefit from racial privilege for the most part. It enjoins us to the majority, and that itself looks a lot like a move towards equating Jews with whiteness. Within the work that we do, that I'm guessing many of us do here on this panel, this poses a real and sometimes intractable barrier to seeing Jews included in spaces designed to really address systemic marginalization, discrimination, and injustice. I've been thinking a lot about what this would mean to lean more heavily on conspiracism and its threat to democracy as a kind of strategy for effecting positive change in the campus space. I think on the pro side, rather than calling from the margins and requiring that a coalition of minorities validate our status as fellow dispossessed, essentially positioning us to engage in conversation that sometimes gets referred to as the oppression Olympics, emphasizing anti-Semitism's links with conspiracism situates Jews as part of a rational center. We and the image of us in the public imagination become a really important barometer of the relative health of our democracy. A focus on the center also lets us direct our energies on the anti-Semitism that's proliferated really on both extremes of the political spectrum, on the extreme left and the extreme right. On the extreme right, the outcome of conspiratorial anti-Semitism tends to be violence. It's something we can't afford to ignore. On the left, it looks a lot like a lockstep kind of march towards fascism, which scholars of conspiracism have warned is one of the key outcomes of widespread conspiratorial thinking. So silencing dissent, turning away from vigorous and heated intellectual exchange, requiring oaths of loyalty to party principles. Many of us here have already heard about the newly founded Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, whose conference on battling IRA will soon be hosted by NYU Law. That gathering requires that audience members adhere to the core principles of the group's mission, which insist that Zionism is an instrument of settler colonial violence, racism, and apartheid. Full stop. No discussion, no room for debate. You must sign on in order to attend. But really on both sides of the political spectrum, conspiracism tends to turn Jews into figural emblems of vice that solely and uniquely are made to bear the marks of a whole host of societal evils. These really are the hallmarks of conspiratorial thinking. And they also, uncoincidentally, form the core of Natan Sharansky's 3D test: demonization, double standards, delegitimization. If a wide swath of Jewish communal organizations were to readjust the lens of campus advocacy with this key focus on conspiracism, we would certainly be moving in the direction of enlisting the broad support, not of a coalition of minorities bound by structural oppression, but by an older, and some might say more old-fashioned, notion of finding common cause and common endeavor in our shared democracy and combating the cancers that corrode it. It's possible that leaning into the connection between conspiracism and the things that it yields, particularly on the left, when Jews become the focus of these moralizing diatribes about a litany of global evils, it's possible this could yield a clearer and more nuanced line between acceptable critique of Israel and line-crossing anti-Semitic speech. Certainly, the focus on conspiracism lends itself to a focus on the perils of disinformation and the need to restore fact-based exchanges to dialogues about Israel, Zionism, Jewish identity, and history on college campuses. But on the con side, it also leaves behind the notion that the Jewish cause can be easily enjoined to the cause of progressive politics, at least in any way that doesn't involve a very large shoehorn. And there's a generational divide, too, that I think we need to acknowledge when it comes to those politics. Many young Jews see themselves in the mirror that progressive politics has held up, and they're not going to look to a different source of reflection easily or painlessly. So when we consider that our work consists of advocating for Jewish campus citizens, and especially the well-being of Jewish students, I wonder whether conspiracism and its threat to democracy represents a winning or a timely enough strategy, even if it does forecast an essential truth about the predicament that we're in. So I know that's a somewhat ambivalent conclusion and statement, but with that, I'm going to turn things over to our next panelist.
I think ambivalence is going to be the overarching theme of this talk. Thank you, Sara, for your comments. I think we'll go to Richard Herman next.
Right, for thanks, and thanks to all of you, Miriam and Rafa, for convening us all, and of course thanks for all the speakers' comments to this point. So let me. I was struck by Sarah's comment about the AJC trip, which I had been on years ago. I was struck, but not surprised that nobody knew about the national strategy, sadly. But so let me speak from a couple of perspectives. One, in my present work with the Jewish Federation, I help bring Israeli visitors to the United States, and on more than one occasion, we encounter anti-Semitism on campuses, objections to one or more of the speakers by students. It's not, I wouldn't say it's rife. The speakers series does what it's supposed to do, tell Israel's story, and occasionally encounters activist students led by our favorite organization, SJP. But having said that, I want to reflect more on my time as Chancellor at UIUC and my present role as co-chair of the Chancellor's Committee on Campus and Jewish Life. I have been fortunate to have partners in that endeavor. Erez Cohen, who was director of Hillel, and more recently, David Teichtel, who's the Chabad rabbi on campus. We have alumni and faculty and students as a part of that group. And as has been mentioned earlier, this was seen as a response to dealing with the rise of campus anti-Semitism. But I guess I would say personally, we've made some progress on what I would call the easy lift things. I mean, when we talk about campus and Jewish life, we decided to tackle the issue of calendar so that the faculty recognize all the holidays and the students don't have to go begging each time. And that's making some progress, and we're trying to reach out to other minority groups, to other religious minority groups, to come up with a concise list of holidays. But I think the things that occur to me are, and one of them I think has already been mentioned personally, and we're not getting any place in this. I would certainly like to see a Jewish voice in the DEI arena and or the provost office, because some of the decisions that get made simply don't make any sense. I'm not condemning people, but it's just a lack of perspective. And I would say that has yet to take place. And despite the present difficulties at NYU, I was struck by what they did in creating a position to deal with religious life. And while some of those, and I've met the individual, a rabbi who took over as in that position, she's really quite wonderful. And I give a lot of credit to Linda Mills, who's now president. I guess she's been, well, she's been named. I don't know whether the ceremony's taken place, but she's quite wonderful. And I think we learned a lot from her, and obviously from AEN. You know, one of the things we've been dealing with, I think, is as institutions, is the lack of institutional neutrality. And here I would use that in the sense of the University of Chicago, where people feel free to speak on political topics, purporting to represent the department faculty, and never really. I think it's in many ways an abrogation of free speech, especially for the younger people who are afraid to speak out. And this is one thing. I don't know whether we as a group can speak to that, but I would hope that in enforcing some institutional neutrality would be one of the things that we could undertake, or at least suggesting it. And I do worry about that when it comes to departmental speech, especially when it occasionally crosses into, as it has, supporting blood libels, even when the institution itself is very clear that, and at Illinois, we had, at UIUC, we had a wonderful statement issued by the Chancellor and JUF and the Brandeis Center and Hillel Chabad about Zionism being an existential part of Judaism for many Jews. And still we see things on web pages by student organizations which contradict that. And this takes on the weight of institutional statements, which I think are to me would be very concerning. And in a way, when if it's not free speech, if it's on a website that's supported by the university, would I don't know, Alyza can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in these instances it requires the leadership to speak out. And I guess along those lines, I think it's important when incidents take place for leadership to speak out and speak out quickly. If reactions are 4 weeks and 2 months or 3 months later, it loses the effect. I mean, and I'm not a big fan of mass mails, but I do think mass mails should be, well, if they're mailed, they need to be followed by some action. And the other thing I would observe is that it's important for all groups to be treated the same. So if there are violations like the appearance of a news and we see an immediate reaction against that. The same ought to be true when a swastika appears, or even worse incidents. So I do worry about a lack of equity, or the fact that Jews get treated differently on campuses. And I know recently, we were talking about this beforehand, at UIC, there was a case of individuals who were promoting study abroad in Israel were basically assaulted, and the university had to get police protection to guarantee their safety. And eventually the program for that year was canceled. On the positive side, I think we're engaging in a lot of training for faculty and students. Partly, I know AEN has been doing this, and I know that Hillel International has been doing this. And part of this is educational. We shouldn't assume that because something happens, people are anti-Semitic, but they need to be exposed more and more to ideas. So I guess again, ending where I finished. I'm very happy that there is a national strategy, with all due appreciation both to AEN and AJC, who had a role in bringing it out. But until it sort of is taken up by campus leadership, it's not really going to have a profound effect on campus life. So let me leave it there. Go on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Richard. I want to turn it over to Casey Johnson now. I've made him a co-host, so if he has slides to share, he could do that.
Rafa, thank you, and thank you all for being here. I was asked to speak on events at CUNY, which is the nation's largest public university campus of 250,000, and also a campus that just seems to come up over and over and over again in this area. And I think CUNY, at least to me, is a case study that kind of exemplifies what the three speakers previously had been speaking of. In Miriam's case, I think what we've seen at CUNY exemplifies the ways in which the national strategy, which I think is just wonderful, will not address all of the issues that we're confronting on campus. CUNY is a classic example of the point that Sara was making about how there are some progressives who look in the mirror and don't see concerns about Israel in a reflection back, and this intersection between a type of progressive politics and a kind of almost Corbynite anti-Israel approach is very prevalent at CUNY. And I think CUNY also is a great illustration of the point that Richard was making about the importance of leadership. Alas, we are an example on the other side of how poor leadership consistently has, I think, exacerbated these problems that I have on the screen here. When we scheduled this, we had no way of knowing there would be the latest outburst at CUNY. But 3 days ago, this email came around from the president of the Graduate Center announcing an abrupt resignation 1 month into the term, something that just never happens at CUNY, in the aftermath of a firestorm over the appointment of Mark Lamont Hill to a tenured professorship at the Graduate Center. So these issues of this kind of tension between a kind of far left obsession with Israel that sometimes crosses over into at least anti-Semitic tropes and the sort of conspiracism that Sara was talking about, but sometimes is clever enough not to, and the attitudes that we've seen constantly come up. And so I just wanted to talk about a couple of quite high-profile examples of this pattern at CUNY over the last couple of years. I mean, the frustrating thing about being at CUNY is it seems like these issues just come up over and over and over again. So the first one that I wanted to talk about, this is from 2 years ago in 2021 during the conflict in Gaza. During the conflict, the CUNY Faculty Union, we are or at least pre-Janus, we were a closed shop, state, New York. That is, that everyone had to be a member of the union. They could opt out, but they still basically paid dues. So the union is representing all of us. The union, which has an international committee, that is, it sees itself as a foreign policy unit, although why anyone would care what CUNY faculty say about foreign policy is unclear. The International Committee proposed a resolution, which I've screenshotted over here on the left, which among other things accused Israel of murdering 2,104 Palestinians. This resolution was unanimously approved by 3 committees of the faculty union, one of only 2 university-wide faculty bodies at CUNY. More than 30 members supported. In response, the executive council of the union proposed what it deemed a more moderate resolution, which and I've highlighted the key portion of the resolution over on the right. Decided that the 2021 conflict in Gaza began not with the murder of the 3 Israeli Jewish teenagers in the West Bank, or in the Hamas rocket attack on Jerusalem, but instead on May the 15th, 2021, which is when Israel responded with a military attack on Gaza. This was an ahistorical view. And the resolution called for what they deemed structured conversations with individual faculty members all around CUNY to discuss BDS. This resolution was approved by the faculty union by a 3-to-1 margin. You can get a sense of the debate from I did a piece on this in Tablet, and I've quoted some of fortunately the union held this debate via Zoom, and a video of the tape was leaked. You can get a sense of the context of the debate. The 3-to-1 margin in favor of the resolution was deceptive, because a significant chunk of the union members who voted against the delegate assembly resolution did so because they were mad that the original resolution that accused Israelis of murder had been substituted out for the supposedly more moderate resolution. The president of the union, a man named James Davis, who is head of an organization called New Caucus, which is it's a kind of classic progressive campus labor movement, during the debate presented himself as a kind of moderate voice on this issue. He claimed there was no roll call vote. He claimed to have voted against the resolution. He said he wanted to welcome all voices. But in the aftermath of the resolution, these campus discussions about promoting BDS organized by the union occurred, and Davis appeared at one of these gatherings. Davis is we'll listen to him here in a second. Again, this was a person who had presented himself as a kind of neutral figure on these issues.
Like I have my own personal views on Israel-Palestine, and I was a member of the American Studies Association in 2013. Tony, when you were talking about that vote about BDS, and voted in favor there.
So the moderate voice of the CUNY faculty union was a longtime supporter of BDS. And in response to this, there were several responses, many of which were, I think, encouraging within CUNY. There were 2 faculty groups that were created, one of which called for greater dialogue, the second of which I was a part, urged members to simply resign from the union, since in the aftermath of Janus, resignation from the union would deny union dues. And there were a couple hundred members who resigned, which seems to have had at least some effect on the union bottom line. But there were also calls, and this kind of echoes the point that Richard was just making, for the CUNY administration to involve itself in this in one particular area. That is, that when we had a situation where the union, whose job includes representing untenured faculty members who want to file grievances if they feel that they've been unjustly approached, if we have a situation in which the union is holding structured conversations with these untenured faculty, urging them to promote BDS, this is an inherent conflict of interest. And we urge the central administration to come out with a statement basically telling untenured faculty members who oppose BDS that CUNY would have their backs and that they needn't bow to pressure. Instead, the chancellor issued basically a statement saying that he washed his hands of the episode. That some people are pro-DS at CUNY, some are anti-BDS, and CUNY is, CUNY is not going to. CUNY is institutionally it opposes BDS, but we're not going to take a position on these internal faculty debates. The union push, ironically, for what is a far-left union wound up dying off, I think, largely not because of anything the chancellor did, but because they were losing money as a result of this episode. CUNY then popped up again in sort of this area as a result of activities at CUNY Law School. And there at CUNY Law, there was the faculty promoted a BDS resolution. This triggered again another kind of response from the administration saying this is bad, but we're not going to be doing anything about it. And that followed up with this very controversial commencement day address.
I want to celebrate CUNY Law as one of the few, if not the only law school, to make a public statement defending the right of its students to organize and speak out against Israeli settler colonialism. That this is the law school that passed and endorsed BDS on a student and faculty level. And we did all of this in spite of the racism, in spite of the selective activism, the self-serving interests of CUNY Central, an institution that continues to fail us, that continues to train and cooperate with the fascist NYPD, the military, that continues to train IDF soldiers to carry out that same violence globally. A larger institution committed to its donors, not to its students.
If the CUNY Central Administration is training the IDF is in a lot of trouble. But you can see the conspiracism here. The Chancellor and the administration did issue a statement in the aftermath of this because there was a firestorm, but the statement was completely off base. It condemned the speech, alleging that it was hate speech, which is not a term that is defined at CUNY, and which, given the ideological complexion of CUNY, would most likely be applied to pro-Zionist rather than anti-Zionist forces. And in response, we got a huge letter in support of the speaker from CUNY law professors and other CUNY faculty around the system. One final clip that I wanted to play. Last summer, at summer 2022, the New York City Council decided to do an investigation of anti-Semitism, but also hardline anti-Israel attitudes at CUNY. And this exchange, which is an exchange between Chancellor Urbana-Champaign, who's done really good work on this issue, and a CUNY senior administrator. The Chancellor declined the day before the hearing to appear at the hearing and sent a senior administrator who this was clearly not her fault, in his place. You get a sense of the exchange of where I think the administration at CUNY has failed. What Urbana-Champaign really wants is for CUNY to recognize that this obsession with Israel suggests a broader campus culture at CUNY. And that's clearly not where any of the CUNY senior administrators want to go.
Are you aware of any campaign on any CUNY campus to boycott, divest, and sanction any of these countries for their human rights violations? Russia?
Not aware, no.
China?
I'm not aware.
Iran?
I'm not aware.
Saudi Arabia?
I am not aware, no.
North Korea?
Not aware.
How about the state of Israel?
We talked about the BDS resolutions that were passed at the law school, and we've condemned them. So yes, there have been for Israel, yes.
You really sense the heartiness of the condemnation there. Thanks.
Thought she was taking the fifth.
Right. Thank you, Casey, for that deep dive into the Energizer Bunny of campus anti-Semitism. They just seem to keep going and going and going. And so, last but absolutely not least, we have Alyza Lewin. Please go ahead, Alyza.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Rafa. Thank you, AEN, for putting this program together and for inviting me to participate. So, the national strategy. I agree with some of the comments that were made before, that I think one of the most important pieces of it is that it was a national strategy issued by the president and the administration that really highlighted and put a focus on this issue, and perhaps most importantly, emphasized that this is not just a Jewish problem, that anti-Semitism is society's problem and will require a whole of society approach to combat it. That I think is an extremely important message to send. It was disappointing that the strategy was not as clear or explicit in its discussion of anti-Zionism as I think would have been necessary and would have been helpful. So, for example, there is one sentence or two sentences in the national strategy which have been quoted, where they said and recognized, when we're talking specifically about our campus concerns, where the anti-Zionism is burgeoning, and it's one of our great challenges as to how we deal with it, as we're hearing in terms of CUNY, for example. So there is a sentence which says, Jewish students and educators are targeted for derision and exclusion on college campuses, often because of their real or perceived views about the state of Israel. When Jews are targeted because of their beliefs or their identity, when Israel is singled out because of anti-Jewish hatred, that is anti-Semitism, and that is unacceptable. Now, that's a good sentence. I might have drafted it a little bit differently, but it's a good sentence. But you would have anticipated then that sentence or two sentences might have been included if you were going to look and see, well, what was the Department of Education then going to do in terms of its follow through and the directives that the national strategy had for the Department of Education? So one of the key follow-throughs was that the Department of Education was going to send out a Dear Colleague letter to all administrators across the country, at universities across the country, which they promptly did the very same day that the national strategy was issued. And so you would think, if you're talking to administrators on campuses and you want them to understand the anti-Semitism that we're seeing on campus, wouldn't you include these sentences which are talking about the anti-Semitism that's targeting Jewish students and faculty members? Well, those two sentences from the national strategy don't appear in that letter that was sent to administrators. In fact, there's no mention of Israel or Zionism or discriminating against Jews on the basis of their identity in that letter. And in fact, the Department of Education then went and put up on its own website its description of its anti-Semitism policies and kind of their efforts pursuant to this. And you would think then that in that description, maybe they would talk about how they are working on combating this form of anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination. And these two sentences don't appear there either. So one of the things that I think is important is I think we need to be pushing the Department of Education to be as bold as the administration was in its introduction to this national strategy. And we need to be saying to OCR, right, and to the Department of Education, you need to say at least this much when you're talking about your efforts to combat anti-Semitism. I honestly think that what this shows is the intense divide that's going on in the administration behind the scenes, right? I think somebody was able to get this language in here, but wasn't able to get it in the follow through. Now, when you talk about letters and inquiries that different organizations were getting after this national strategy came out, one of the questions that we at the Brandeis Center were hearing regularly was, well, what is the situation with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, with the IRA definition of anti-Semitism? Is the administration still using the IRA definition? And the answer to that is yes. And I will explain to you how that is clear. So first of all, even though the national strategy, in its discussion, in its little paragraph about definitions, talked about how the IRA definition is the most prominent and that it's been embraced by the US, they gave their little welcome nod to the Nexus Declaration and the Nexus document. And the question is, what kind of legal weight does that carry? And the answer is none, zero. Because two things. One is the national strategy itself has a whole legal disclaimer at the beginning that says that the document has zero legal impact. But number two, it does nothing to change the Executive Order 13899 on combating anti-Semitism that was issued in 2019. And the Department of Education is still abiding by and following the executive order. So what was the executive order on combating anti-Semitism? Well, just to give a quick little background lesson on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, because that you'll need to understand. So when we use the law to try and protect students or members of the university communities from anti-Semitism on the university campuses, one of the most important legal tools that we have at our disposal is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act applies to any entity that receives federal government funds. And it basically requires that those entities have to guarantee that the opportunities that they provide are being provided in a non-discriminatory fashion. If you are discriminating, you are not eligible for those funds. That's a condition of receiving those funds. Pretty much every single institution of higher education in the United States, including private universities, receives some amount of federal funding. That's why Title VI of the Civil Rights Act applies to almost all universities in the United States. And what that means is that the universities have to make sure that all of their opportunities are equally accessible to all. If you have a community that is being marginalized or shunned or excluded, treated differently, not able to take advantage of all of the university's opportunities the same way, then the university is at risk of being in violation of Title VI and losing its federal funding. When you have a Title VI violation, you can either go file a case in federal court, or you can file an administrative complaint with the Department of Education. The office in the Department of Education that handles those complaints is called the Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, and it reviews the Title VI complaints. What happened back in 2004 initially is that there's one hiccup when it comes to Title VI protecting Jews and other members of faith-based communities, which is that when Title VI was drafted, it did not include religion as a protected category. So it protects from discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin. It doesn't include religion. And the question came up, particularly after 9/11, when Muslims were experiencing discrimination and when Sikhs, who were being mistaken for Muslims, were experiencing discrimination in educational institutions and were filing complaints with the Department of Education. The question came up as to whether Title VI even applies to members of faith-based groups if religion is not a protected category. And at that point, Ken Marcus, who is the founder of the Brandeis Center, where I'm now the president, he was the acting assistant secretary for civil rights in the Department of Education, which heads the Office of Civil Rights. And he issued a Dear Colleague letter in 2004 that made clear that when members of faith-based groups like Jews, Sikhs, Muslims are being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity, they are covered by Title VI. In other words, when members of religious groups are being targeted on the basis of one of these other categories, race, national ethnic origin, they don't lose that protection just because they also share a common faith. That was in 2004 in the Bush administration. In 2010 in the Obama administration, the Department of Justice adopted that same understanding, sent out their own Dear Colleague letter. So by that point, you had an understanding that when members of faith-based groups are targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry or ethnicity, that is covered by Title VI. What did the executive order do? The executive order raised that understanding of Title VI to the level of a presidential executive order, applied it to all the government agencies that give out funding, and it linked Title VI to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And it said to all these government agencies, if you ever are investigating a complaint under Title VI, because somebody is claiming that one of the recipients of federal funds is discriminating on the basis of anti-Semitism, right? How will you know what anti-Semitism is? you will look to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. That's the definition that will be used by these government agencies when investigating Title VI complaints. That was the executive order issued by President Trump in 2019. It married Title VI with the IRA definition. The current administration, when it began, continued to follow this executive order. There were other executive orders that they dismissed and decided not to follow, but this executive order is one that they are still following, and there are multiple times that this administration has actually expressed its commitment to the executive order. So first of all, there is what they call frequently asked questions, an FAQ, or guidance specifically on the executive order. It's frequently asked questions about Executive Order 13899. That is current guidance on the current Department of Education website. And it has been since day one. When there are multiple times now that Catherine Lehman, who is now the current Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the Department of Education, when there have been several communications that she has sent out where she has referenced and talked about the administration's commitment to Executive Order 13899 and circulated these frequently asked questions as a resource. So for example, that letter that was sent to administrators the same day as the national strategy included a list of resources for administrators, and included in those resources were the frequently asked questions on Executive Order 13899. So she was sending out, she didn't explicitly mention Israel or IRA or anti-Zionism in her letter, but in her resources that she sent to them, she sent in that list the frequently asked questions on Executive Order 13899. The other ways that we can see that the Department of Education is still using this and following this understanding of the law is in the actions that have been taken by the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education. So first of all, in April, shortly before the national strategy came out, the Biden administration issued its first resolution agreement in a campus anti-Semitism case. It was in response to a complaint that the Brandeis Center had filed at the University of Vermont. The University of Vermont case dealt overwhelmingly with instances of anti-Zionism. So there was, for example, a sexual assault survivors club at University of Vermont that had posted on its Instagram account that it was blocking Zionists. When Jewish students tried to engage, they said, no, we don't deal with Zionists. We're not talking to you. There was also a book club that was included on the university's websites with their various book clubs, their Revolutionary Socialist Union Book Club, which required students to pledge no to certain things in order to be a member of the book club. And that included pledging no to racism and to Islamophobia and homophobia and transphobia and a whole long list, including anti-Semitism, but also including having to pledge no to Zionism. And then there was a teaching assistant at the University of Vermont who would regularly and repeatedly on social media target Zionists. She posted even about the serotonin rush of cyberbullying Zionists online. One of her tweets, for example, said, and I quote, "Is it unethical for me, a TA, to not give Zionists credit for participation? I feel like it is good and funny. -5 points for going on Birthright in 2018, -10 for posting a pic with a tank in the Golan Heights, -2 points just because I hate your vibe in general," close quote. So this was these were all included in the University of Vermont complaint. And what happened is the Department of Education ended up negotiating what they call a resolution agreement. Most of these complaints resolve with resolution agreements. The universities do not want to lose their federal funding. So they basically negotiate a settlement with the Department of Education to understand what steps do we need to take in order to make sure that we can continue getting our funding. What do we have to do to address this, the discrimination? And so the university, among other things, required them to modify their anti-discrimination policies and their training in order to address this kind of discrimination. But now you have an administration, as we see from the national strategy, that feels that there are certain terms that are buzzwords that they can't use. So for example, they're not ready to say Zionism. They're not ready to explicitly talk about IRA. They're not ready to say Israel. So what do? So in the resolution agreement, the way they treated this form of anti-Semitism and this form of discrimination is they referred to it as national origin discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry. And that is now, right, the way that the anti-Zionism is being recognized and treated. And it's extremely important for us to understand this distinction, right? The idea is that when there are Jews, right, who express support for Israel, that is growing out of the Jews' shared ancestral history in the land of Israel. That's where the Jewish people are rooted. Individuals may be very critical of the policies of the current government of Israel or any government of Israel, right? They may express that, but their support for the right of Jewish self-determination in some borders stems from that belief that this is the ancestral Jewish homeland and Jews have a right to self-determination today in some borders there. And that is not a political viewpoint. That is a pride in Jewish ancestral heritage. This is an issue of Jewish identity, not an issue of political views. And so what's happening when you're saying Zionists aren't welcome or you have to pledge no to Zionism is you are then discriminating against Jews on the basis of their ancestral ethnic heritage, which is an integral component of their Jewish identity. The first, and I'll just wrap up with this, the very first investigation that was opened in response to a complaint after the national strategy, the very first one, was in response to another complaint that we filed. This was what was announced by the Department of Education at SUNY New Paltz, which involved another sexual assault survivor group where 2 Jewish students were thrown out of a club. One of them had actually helped found it when they had posted on their own personal Instagram accounts an infographic that said that Jews are an ethnic group that come from Israel and you can't colonize a place that you are from. And then the co-chairs cut off these students from the club and then launched a whole attack on them on social media that got to be so intense that they had to leave campus for their own safety and security. The Department of Education opened up that investigation after the national strategy, which once again shows that they are taking the anti-Zionism seriously and sending a clear message to universities that they need to do the same.
Thank you so much, Alyza. Thank you to the rest of our panelists for sharing your diverse perspectives, your organizational and personal perspectives. We look forward to working with you and your organizations in the upcoming year to meet these challenges. I want to stop recording now so that we can